Let's talk about vehicle movement. I put a poll up on the YouTube channel community asking what video I should make next, and a boot camp talking about vehicle movement won out just slightly over a let's play scenario highlighting how vehicles are used in an actual scenario, which I'll probably do down the road after I get this video done and up. As usual, this video will be broken up into segments with timestamps so you can jump to a topic that is of more interest to you if you feel the need. Because I'm going to cover a bunch of different things here, starting with vehicle types, um, the actual mechanics of vehicle movement, including how you use movement points, starting and stopping, delaying, changing covered arc, that kind of thing. Then what I think some people are interested in is the state of a vehicle, vehicle's movement state, I guess you'd call it. And there are three states that a vehicle can be in: stopped, non-stopped, and in motion or motion. And I think that's the part of vehicle movement that really trips some people up in trying to wrap their head around that. Now, some of the topics I'll be talking about may not apply to starter kit. You will know that if you've read the vehicle rules for starter kit. So just bear with me because I'm trying to mix up both game systems in here. For example, I will briefly touch on reverse movement, which isn't in starter kit. I don't know why, because it is extremely simple and kind of useful sometimes. Things like that. So bear with me, starter kit users. There'll be a few things in here that may not apply to you, but we will get through it. All right. Let's start off with the vehicle types. Now there are basically 5 vehicle types. I think I'll put a little graphic up in this upper right corner as I go through these. And let's start off with what's called fully tracked. Typically an AFV, almost all AFVs, armored fighting vehicles, vehicles that have armor factors, um, are considered fully tracked. And you can tell if a vehicle is fully tracked, or you can tell what type of vehicle it is by the white silhouette behind the movement points in the upper right corner. If you look at this chart up in the upper right, you can see that a large, I guess you call it an oval or an oblong circle, is a fully tracked vehicle, and the number represents the number of movement points that a vehicle has. Uh, Infantry uses movement factors, and vehicles use movement points. Slight difference so that when the rules are referring to moving, you know whether the rule is referring to infantry movement or vehicle type movement. So infantry movement factors, vehicles movement points, but they essentially work the same, very similar. Okay. Next up, we have a half track. Everyone's probably familiar with what a World War II half track looks like. Has tracks in the back and traditional wheels up front. Thus, the indicator of a small circle in front of an oblong oval, denoting that the front has axled wheels and the rear has tracks, and that's a half track. Now you notice that this vehicle has, I pulled this one out specifically because it has red movement factor. That usually indicates that the vehicle has some sort of mechanical reliability issue, and you usually have to make a die roll when you spend a start movement point to get the vehicle going. And I'll go over starting and stopping here shortly. Always, as always, check your chapter H vehicle notes to make sure you understand exactly, or the back of the counter, make sure you fully understand what the red means, because they can be slightly different depending on the vehicle. But it's usually mechanical reliability and it has a chance of breaking down when you start it up and kind of put it in gear to get moving. Okay. The next vehicle is an armored car. And you can tell it's an armored car because the movement points has a solid white circle behind it. Okay. Now you see this one, the armored cars are usually pretty fast. This one has 34 movement points, but that's a bit misleading because um, non-tracked vehicles have to spend a lot more moving through terrain that for a fully tracked would cost very little. For example, fully tracked moving through an open ground, not taking into account mud or snow or what have you, costs 1 movement point. An armored car, I believe, let me look at my chart on the side here, it costs 4. Car, open ground, costs 3 movement points to enter an open ground hex. So even though it shows 34, they can zip around on roads really fast. But once they get off road, they end up being about as fast as an AFV because it costs more movement points to enter those type of hexes. Okay. Now look at the movement factor. Sorry, movement point. I almost flubbed up there. Has an asterisk next to it. That almost always means look at the back of the counter unless the asterisk is to the right of a gun like this, which means it's a short barrel. But any other asterisks next to some sort of number means look at the back. Let's flip it over and it says here, uh, asterisk, reverse is ×3. Normally, reverse movement point expenditure costs 4 times the terrain. For this, it's 3 times. So it's a little bit better at reversing than the average ASL vehicle. Okay. The next vehicle we have is a truck. And it's a little hard to see, but it's got two, let's see if I can draw it down here. It's got 2 circles like this, meaning it's a double axled vehicle where a armored car has 1 solid circle in the background. It's a little hard to see on this one. Okay. Now, one thing to note with all of these vehicle types is you can have a truck movement factor on some vehicles that actually have armor and are considered AFVs. We played a scenario last year sometime, and there were these really crappy Japanese AFVs that were considered AFVs. They had really light armor, but they had truck movement rate because they were basically AFVs stuck on a truck chassis. So make sure just because has a truck uh, movement icon like this doesn't necessarily mean it's an actual truck. It just means it has to spend truck movement point values on your movement chart here to navigate terrain. Okay, one thing to watch out for. And then lastly, we have excuse me, still have the slight COVID cough. We have motorcycles. They have no special icon underneath the movement point value because they have it's a motorcycle. It's a motorcycle on the counter, so you know it's a motorcycle. And they have their own column in the movement point table. Okay. So I talked about the number being on the counter being the number of movement points a vehicle has. Red being mechanical reliability or mechanical breakdown. If you have a vehicle, and I don't I don't have one here, that has a superscript on the movement point that's also a number, that means it has the capability for amphibious movement. And there aren't many vehicles that have that. Americans have quite a few of them because they did a lot of beach landings in the South Pacific, and obviously when they invaded maybe North Africa, they used some when they invaded Sicily and Italy, and then when they did landings at Normandy, they had some vehicles that could both move in water and on land. So if you see a superscript on a movement point value, that means it's capable of amphibious movement. Okay. Now let me move this out of the way, and let's and move these out of the way. Different vehicle types, and let's just briefly look at the movement chart here. Terrain chart. This is ETO terrain. There's different terrain charts for, I don't know where they are in these charts, for PTO and desert. Okay. And basically for the different vehicle types, you've got motorcycle, armored car, fully tracked, half track, and truck, just like I showed you. And it shows you, here's the terrain type, and this is a chart you look at to know how much it costs to enter each different type of terrain for the 5 different vehicles. Okay. So make sure you understand this chart. Most of the time you're going to be using open ground and road vehicles, and vehicles don't, you can enter woods and buildings. It doesn't happen quite often. You might do some bypass movement, which I am not going to cover in this video. Bypass movement is a completely separate topic that can be talked about. But typically, um, you need to understand open ground for the most part, changing elevation, I would say, going over walls and hedges, and roads for each of the different vehicles. Those are the ones you're going to be using the most, okay? And the amount that it costs for each of these different types of vehicles to navigate that terrain is different. That's independent from the movement point value that's up in the upper right of each vehicle counter. All right. Next, let's talk about the mechanics of actually moving. Let's say we have this vehicle here. This is a Panzer 4H, I think. Yeah, Panzer 4H out in the field here. And let's say it's just sitting there. It's stopped. It's not in motion, which I'll talk about here shortly. It's just stopped, and it's now the Germans' movement phase. It has 13 movement points. Let's assume that weather is normal. There's no snow or mud or what have you, and it can move normally. Now, to move, the first thing you have to do is spend a start movement point because it's just sitting there. And when you spend a start movement point, it costs one movement point to start. Okay, and that does not make you a moving target until you're not a moving target until you move into a new hex, but you can still be fired on. So a common tactic is during defensive fire is if you have a vehicle in your line of sight and you want to take a shot at it, shoot at it. Usually shoot at it immediately when it spends the start movement point. Because if you don't and it starts moving, say it moves to there and expends 2 movement points, 1 to start, 1 to enter here, it'd be at 2 movement points. It's now moving, it's going to be harder to hit. So make sure if you need to shoot at it right when it spends, right after it expends the start movement point. Okay, now once it's started, it can move anywhere. Open ground is 1 movement point. I'm just going to do some movement here. And so 1 to start, it can only move into its covered arc, right? So its covered arc is this, right? So it can only move into these 2 hexes without, otherwise it needs to change its covered arc to move into a different hex from this hex, okay? Let me get this out of the way so I don't make a mess out of my counter. So the only place I can move are one of these 2 hexes or change its covered arc. Let's just say it wants to go to here. So that's 2, 1 to start, and then 1 to move into open ground for a fully tracked vehicle. That's 2. Let's say it wants to suddenly move this way. Now it can only, again, its covered arc is these 2 hexes. It can only move into one of these 2 hexes. So what it's going to do is it's going to spend 1 movement point to change its covered arc to there. Each hex spine that the vehicle covered arc changes costs 1 movement point. So he's at 3. Now he can move into one of these 2 hexes. So he could go 3, 4 to there, 5, 6. Orchards only cost 1 for fully tracked. What did I say? 6, 7. Let's change covered arc again. 8, 9. And since he's still buttoned up, a road, you don't get the road movement rate unless you're crew exposed. I think I said he's at 9. So this would be 10. Now he could go crew exposed. Let's just say he goes crew exposed. You can button up and crew expose only once during the movement phase. You can't pop in and out. So now that he's crew exposed, he has to stay there, stay crew exposed until the advanced phase. Then he could rebutton up. But now the road only costs a half because he's crew exposed. He can see much better. I forget what I was at. 10, maybe 10. So 10 and a half, 11, 12. Okay, I'm just gonna move this. to the side. He's still crew exposed. He's at 12. Now he has a choice here. He can expend 1 movement point to stop, or he could delay 1 movement point for 13 and be in motion, or he could move to one of these hexes for 13 and still be in motion as well. If you don't, excuse me, if you don't spend a stop or delay, I believe a delay is included as well. Yeah, if you don't spend a stop or delay movement point at the end of your movement phase, after the movement phase ends, you're considered to be in motion. And that's one of the states of movement that I'm going to talk about here shortly. Okay. Now let's back up here and talk about delay. Okay. Delay and expenditure of movement points. A vehicle needs to expend every movement point it possesses. In this case, 13. And the reason infantry don't have to do that, you can, well, let me back up. If a vehicle chooses to move, it must expend 13 movement, in this case, 13 movement points. Infantry don't have to do that. They can move, they can spend 1 movement factor and stop and do whatever they want, right? Or go 2 and stop. A vehicle, vehicles have to expend all their movement points to model things like moving slower or faster and waiting and things like, and starting and stopping. So, but you can expend them in any way you want, which is interesting. So I could go 1 movement point. This is kind of a weird. Let's go back. Let's put them up here. Let's pretend this is an enemy vehicle. This covered arc is this way. They can't see each other, right? But let's just say his turret covered arc is like that. But this tank wants to come around these woods and maybe take a shot at this tank. So you could go 1, 2, and then this guy would take a shot, or you could keep moving, or you would stop and take a shot. But what you might want to do is go, he's got 13 movement points. I'm going to move this to the side. So 1 to start, delay 10, you'd be at 11 total. Be 12 to there, and then stop 1, you'd be at 13. You'd spend all your movement points, and forget what this guy was here. You would have only spent 2 movement points in the line of sight of this, instead of coming out here and maybe moving to here, wherever, to take a shot and spending a bunch of movement points. Thus making it slightly easier for him to hit. That might be one reason why you use delay. Another way to do it is you can spend extra movement points to, say, go over a hedge here, just to kind of simulate that your vehicle is moving slower. So you could, instead of spending, you could go 1 to start. You could go, you could say I spend 5 to go over the hedge, plus 1 to move into the wheat. So that would be 7. Instead of normally it would be 1 to start, 2, 3. Okay. So if you have to spend all your movement points, but you have to make sure you do it in a way, especially when you're in the line of sight of the enemy. You need to do it in a way such that you're not putting your vehicle in more jeopardy than it needs to. But you also have to make sure you spend all of your movement points during movement. Okay. So I talked about start, delay, and stop. Okay. Let's talk about reverse movement. Let's say your vehicle's here and you want to reverse. You have to spend 1 to start, but you have to announce reverse start. Okay. And then it costs 4 times whatever terrain you're moving into to reverse. And you can only reverse into your rear covered arc axis, same as if you're moving forward. So that would be 1 for reverse start, 5 to move to there. Okay. Now let's say you wanted to go forward from there for some reason. So you're at 5, you'd have to spend 1 to stop, 6, then 1 to start forward for 7, then you go 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, stop for 13. You've spent all 13 of your movement points. Let's briefly talk about turreted covered arc. You can freely change your turret covered arc during movement. Each time you spend a movement point, you can change your covered arc in any direction. So I go 1 to start. I've spent a movement point, so I could say, okay, normally your turret covers like that. I'd say 1 to start, and I could go, okay, I'm changing my turret covered arc that direction. Then you go 2, 3, 4. You could even change it like that as you're moving. Each time you expend a movement point, you can freely change your turret covered arc. Okay, that's very easy. Okay, let's get into the interesting part of this, and that's the stopped, non-stopped, and motion. Let me put this graphic up here to talk about what each of those means. Okay. Stopped, non-stopped motion. The vehicle movement states that trip people up. Okay, stopped it's actually pretty simple. Uh, It took me a minute to grok it early on, but it's actually fairly simple. Stopped is a vehicle that has expended a stop movement point during its movement phase or ended its movement phase by expending a stop movement point. So during the movement phase, you can actually stop and start again. So anytime you expend a stop movement point while you're moving during your movement phase, you're considered stopped. Or if you end the movement phase by expending a stop movement point, you're also considered stopped. Okay. Now there's a difference between stopped and moving target. Even though let me move this out of the way, the graphic, put the tank out here real quick. Even though you're considered stopped, you're still considered a moving target if someone fires at you. Okay. When you're stopped, it just means when you fire, you're going to impose fewer penalties when you're stopped, but you're still considered moving. Anytime a vehicle changes a hex, they're considered a moving target, where no matter what state they're in, until I believe the end of the advancing fire phase. Okay. So say I have an enemy guy over here. Pretend that's an enemy. And he's there and he goes 1 to start and he moves to this hex for 2 and then he expends 1 to stop. Even though by definition he is stopped, if this guy fires at him, he's still a moving target for the die roll modifiers for this guy. If this guy fires over here, he's considered to be stopped from a penalty for him firing over here. That's what stopped means. Stopped is what type stopped, non-stopped, and in motion or motion means what penalties am I going to incur as the uh, moving target or the target that has moved or is in control of the active player at that time. A moving target means if the defender fires at him, has it moved? Okay. They're two completely different things. Stop, non-stop motion is for when I choose to fire. What has this vehicle done, or what is it currently doing when it chooses to fire? Moving is when I am fired at, whether I am moving or not. And if you've changed a hex during any turn, whether you're stopped, non-stopped, or in motion, you're considered to be a moving target. Okay. Let's go back to this. Stopped can occur in all phases. Okay. And eliminates all motion to hit die roll modifiers if I choose to fire that tank that I just moved. Non-stopped. A vehicle during its movement phase, that's important, during its movement phase, that has not expended a stop movement point since its last starting movement point expenditure is considered non-stop. And this can only occur in the movement phase. You cannot be by definition, you cannot be a non-stopped vehicle outside the movement phase. This is only during the movement phase. Let me move this and I'll show you what that means. Let's say let's put this guy over here again. He's there. He goes one to start. He's like, oh, I'm going to get in. Let's move him back. He's like, I'm going to get in close to this guy and take a shot. One to start, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I choose to fire without stopping. He's a non-stop firer, which incurs really, really, really bad penalties. The chance to hit, as I call it, is a long shot at best. If you get super lucky on your die roll, you might get a hit. Obviously, I would choose to. I don't think I can probably count the times I've done motion fire on 2 fingers. It's incredible long shot to do. Or sorry, non-stopped or motion fire, meaning you're firing while you're actually in a state other than stopped. Now, what you'd want to do is spend 1 to stop there, and then fire, instead of firing while in a non-stopped state. Okay, so non-stop can only occur during the movement phase. That's the only time it can occur by definition. Let me put this back up. And again, the chance to hit is a long shot at best. Now, motion. A vehicle that did not spend a stop or delay movement point at the end of its movement phase is considered in motion. Okay. Now, as far as penalties go, if I'm firing, they're basically the same, but it occurs outside the current player's movement phase. The chance to hit is a long shot. Okay, let's go back to the example here. Let's just move this guy. Let's say this guy moves. Say he comes on the board here, right? And he's like at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 there, right? And he chooses not to stop at the end of the movement phase. And all the other movement and defensive fire happens, and it's in the defensive final fire. Right at the end of the movement phase, you put a motion counter on him. The only time a motion counter cannot be on a vehicle inside the movement phase, a motion counter indicates that a vehicle did not end its movement phase with a stop or delay. Okay. So now if I fire during the advancing fire phase, the chance to hit is insane. It's the 2 hit is 2 times the lower die roll plus other modifiers on top of it. It's the chance to hit is next to nil almost. So the only time I stay in motion is if I don't plan on firing and or I need to move a long distance, because if you're in motion at the start of the next movement phase, next movement phase, you don't have to spend 1 to start. At the start of the next movement phase, the first thing you do is remove the motion counter, or as soon as you get ready to move him, you remove it, and you don't have to spend 1 to start. You can kind of keep moving. But the only time I leave a motion counter on is at the end of my movement phase is, again, if I'm moving long distances and I want to save a start movement point, or I'm in the line of sight of enemy units and I think I'm going to get fired on before I could get under cover, because I'm still considered a moving target. But motion target, I really don't plan on firing anything at this time. It's more like I'm moving around trying to set up in a position or move across the board with a motion counter. Okay. So those are the differences between stopped, non-stopped, and motion. Okay. Now let me put up this other chart. I don't know. I kind of adopted this from a chart I saw somewhere. I don't know who made it, but I thought it would be very useful. So remember, stopped can occur in any phase. You can be stopped in the obviously in the prep fire phase. You can stop during the prep fire phase, or sorry, the movement phase, and take a shot and then start moving again. Obviously you can be stopped during defensive fire and advancing fire and close combat. Now, non-stop can only occur during the movement phase. That means you moved your vehicle and you're taking a shot without stopping. And then motion can occur in, see, a vehicle that did not expend a stop or delay movement point at the end of its movement phase. It can occur anywhere outside the movement phase. So prep fire phase, defensive fire phase, advancing fire phase, and close combat phase. Okay. So the main difference is between motion and non-stopped. One is during the movement, they incur the same penalties. One occurs during the movement phase because you didn't spend a stop movement point, and all the rest are considered motion, and they're outside the movement phase because you didn't end the movement phase expending a stop movement point. Okay, and then these are the implications for each of these. So if you're stopped, the fire, if you fire the AFV or machine guns, it's simply considered, if you're stopped in the prep fire phase, it's considered prep fire. There's no main armament die roll modifier I mean, there may be others, but there's no die roll modifier. Full machine gun is full firepower, flamethrowers are full firepower. If you're under a motion counter at the beginning of your prep fire, meaning your last movement phase, you didn't spend a stop movement point, you're considered in motion, you cannot fire. You can't fire anything. You must move first, and then you can fire either during your movement or during your advancing fire phase. You can't fire if you're under a motion counter during your prep fire phase. If you're stopped during the movement phase and fire, that's called bounding first fire. And you can see here the cases, die roll modifier cases for full squad leader and starter kit. Half firepower for machine guns, full firepower for flamethrower. Excuse me, full firepower for flamethrower. During the movement phase, if you're non-stopped, that's called non-stop fire, kind of the same as motion fire. Case C4, I think that's the 2 times the lower die roll, 2 hit die roll plus some other modifiers. And case 16 for starter kit. Machine guns are at quarter firepower. So if you're firing while your vehicle is non-stop during the movement phase, your vehicle is basically still moving. Impossible to hit with the main armament, really hard to hit. Maybe if you have a gyro stabilizer, I think you might get a little bit of a bonus there. And machine guns are quarter firepower, flamethrower, half firepower. Defensive fire, if you're stopped, that's simply defensive fire. Again, no die roll modifier for being stopped. Full firepower, full firepower. If it's defensive fire and you have a motion counter on you, that's motion fire, impossible to hit. Half firepower, half firepower. Advancing fire phase, if you stopped during the movement phase and you're still able to fire, that's called bounding fire. That's case B or C or case 1 for starter kit. Half firepower, full firepower. Again, if you're under a motion counter because you didn't end your movement phase spending a stop movement point, that's called motion fire again. Case C4 and case 14, impossible to hit. Not impossible, extremely difficult. Quarter firepower, half firepower. Then close combat, you can be stopped or in motion, and there are implications for machine gun firepower, full, half, and if you're being attacked, if infantry are attacking you, if you're in motion, it's harder to get an effect than if you're stopped. It's harder to attack an AFV or vehicle that's moving in motion versus one that is stopped. Okay. I hope this helps. Let me put that slide up again. Stop, non-stopped motion, because I think the wording in italics makes sense. Stopped, a vehicle that has expended a stop movement point during its movement phase or ended its movement phase by expending a stop movement point. And it can be stopped in all phases. It eliminates all motion to hit die roll. Non-stop, a vehicle during its movement phase that has not expended a stop movement point since its last start movement points. So if you, during the movement phase, if you start and do something without stopping, you're considered to be non-stopped. Can only occur during the movement phase. And then motion is a vehicle that did not expend a stop or delay movement point at the end of its movement phase, and it can only occur outside the current player's movement phase. You can't be in motion during the movement phase. That's what's called non-stopped. Motion is out a non-stop state outside the movement phase. Has the same sort of penalties. Okay. Uh, that's it. Is there anything else I was going to cover? Let me look at my little cheat sheet here. Yeah, I think that's it. Um, if you have any questions about stopped, non-stopped, and motion, um, post them up in the comments below. And either myself or maybe some helpful subscribers will help answer the questions. And I think when I do the smallish Let's Play scenario where I have some guns in vehicles, which will highlight the two-hit process and how stopped, non-stopped, and motion work for vehicles. I think that'll also help a lot. So thanks for watching. This is boot camp number 30 coming to an end. Next boot camp will be, like I said, a Let's Play. And post your questions below. We'll see you later.